All right. Hey there, fellow philosophy enthusiasts. Anyone who's into philosophy knows we're always trying to figure out, like, what's really real.
Yeah.
That's the basic structure of everything. And today we're going to dive into a thinker who maybe isn't as well known as some of the big names, but he's had a pretty big impact. Adolf Reinach.
Yeah, he was a key figure in the early days of phenomenology, the phenomenology movement. And even though he died pretty young, his ideas, they've really stuck with philosophers who are wrestling with some really big questions about, like, what exists, how we know things, and how social stuff works, like societies and stuff.
Totally. And we're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Reinach for this deep dive. It's a super detailed and well-researched piece, so, you're in good hands. Think of it as like a cheat sheet to Reinach's thought,
Yeah.
like a really good one. But what we really want to do today is dig into Reinach's main ideas about ontology, phenomenology, and social theory. And we want to do it in a way that makes sense to, people who are into philosophy, like people who get it. We're hoping you'll have some aha moments, like, oh, wow, this guy was ahead of his time, or, hey, this is a really cool way to think about this. So to start, for anyone who might not know, who was Adolf Reinach? Like, what's his deal? What shaped his philosophy?
Well, he was born in 1883 in Mainz, Germany, into a pretty well-off Jewish family. And he studied a bunch of stuff early on, like law, psychology, and philosophy at the University of Munich. He actually wrote his doctoral thesis about causality, cause and effect, but in the context of criminal law. And his advisor was this guy, Theodor Lipps, who was a big name in the development of what's called inner sense
Oh,
psychology.
yeah, Lips, right. So even early on, he was dealing with the connection between, like, the mind and actions, as people do. But he wasn't just, like, working alone in a room, was he?
Oh, no, not at all. He was part of this group in Munich called the Academic Society for Psychology. It was like a think tank, with some pretty influential people like Johannes Dauber and Alexander Fender. So being in that kind of environment, really got him interested in psychological stuff and how to study it in a really rigorous way. But a really big turning point for him was when he moved to Göttingen to do his habilitation. That's like a postdoctoral thing you need to become a professor in Germany. And while he was there, he worked with Edmund Husserl.
Whoa, Husserl. So he was, like, right in the middle of where phenomenology was starting to take off.
Exactly. Reinach became a central figure in, like, the very beginning of the phenomenological movement. He was super involved in all the intellectual excitement that was going on in both Munich and Göttingen, with those circles of philosophers. And he was really productive too. Like, between 1909 and 1913, he published all this really important stuff.
So what kind of stuff was he, like, writing about back then? What were the main problems he was trying to figure out?
Oh man, all sorts of foundational stuff. Like, he did some groundbreaking work on what negative judgments are, and he took a fresh look at this classic problem that Kant had about how we can have synthetic a priori knowledge. And he also wrote some really insightful stuff about the philosophy of action, like especially about premeditation and intention. And then, of course, there's his masterpiece, you could say, which he published in 1913. It's called The A Priori Foundations of the Civil Law. And that was like the beginning of this whole phenomenological way of understanding law and social institutions.
Wow. So he was really, like, laying down the foundation for this whole new way of thinking about things.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just publishing, right? He was also, like, helping to build up the field as a whole, wasn't he?
Yeah, for sure. He was one of the founders and an editor of the Yearbook for Philosophy and Phenomenological Research, alongside some big names like Husserl, Max Scheler, Erich Rothacker, and Fender, the guy from the Munich group. And that journal, it became like the central hub for developing and spreading phenomenological ideas.
Right, right. But then World War I started, and, that changed everything for so many people, including Reinach.
Yeah, it's really tragic. He joined the German army, converted to the evangelical church, and then died in battle in 1917. He was only 34.
Man, that's so young. It's, like, such a huge loss, especially when you think about all the amazing work he was doing. The Stanford Encyclopedia entry says that his death had a big impact on the phenomenology movement. Like, why was that?
Well, it's kind of interesting. A lot of Husserl's students in Göttingen, people who went on to become pretty important philosophers themselves, like Max Scheler, Hedwig Conrad Martius, Alexandra Koyré, Edith Stein, and Adolf Schopp, they actually thought of Reinach as their main teacher in phenomenology. Like, Conrad Martius even called him the phenomenologist par excellence, which is a pretty big deal. So when he died, it really disrupted things in Göttingen, It's like the field lost this brilliant and original thinker way too soon.
Yeah, that really shows how much he influenced the people around him. And the Giuseppe entry also points to his 1914 lecture concerning phenomenology as a super important text, almost like a mission statement for realist phenomenology.
Huh.
What makes this lecture so special?
Well, it's really where Reinach lays out his own distinct approach to phenomenology. He really emphasizes that it's all about describing the things that exist independently of our minds, like things in themselves, but as they appear in our experience. And what's super cool, I think, is that a lot of his key insights, especially in social ontology and speech act theory, they've actually been rediscovered by philosophers today. Like they came up with similar ideas on their own, often without even knowing about Reinach's work. And I think that shows just how powerful and relevant his ideas still are for tackling those really big fundamental questions in philosophy.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of his philosophy. What
Yeah.
is this realist phenomenology that he's known for? What makes it different?
So, at its core, Reinach's realist phenomenology is all about being super careful and accurate about how things show up in our experience. It doesn't matter if we're talking about perception, memory, understanding language, or even moral intuitions. Reinach thought that all these experiences can directly show us objects and their a priori structures, their essential structures. He called them Wesenszusammenhänge. It's a mouthful, I
Yeah,
know.
a priori structures,
Yeah.
right. That's a biggie. So how did Reinach understand these structures? Like, how are they different from other stuff?
He made this fundamental distinction between contingent states of affairs, which are based on causal relations and, the kind of stuff we discover through observation, like fire produces smoke, that classic example. And then there are a priori states of affairs, which are metaphysically necessary. That means they're true, not because of how the world happens to be, but because of the very nature of the things involved. It's like a mathematical truth, like 3 is greater than 2. You don't observe that. It's like built into what those numbers are.
Right, right. So the essence of a thing or a concept kind of dictates these necessary relationships. Is there like another example that would make sense to, you know, someone who's into philosophy?
Definitely. Think about promising. Reinach argued that it's part of the very essence of a promise to create an obligation for the person who makes the promise and a corresponding claim for the person who's being promised something. It's not just a social convention.
Right.
It's a necessary consequence of what a promise is. Like, similarly, remorse, feeling bad about something you did, that presupposes that you're aware of or remember having done something wrong. These connections aren't random. They're grounded in the essential structures of promising and remorse.
Gotcha. But are these essential structures just like in our minds? Like, are they just ways we categorize the world, or do they have a reality of their own outside of our thoughts?
That's the key to his realism. Reinach was very clear that these a priori structures are mind independent. They're not just projections of how our brains work, they're inherent in the objects and states of affairs themselves. He knew that our minds can, in some cases, bring certain things into being, like we'll see with his social ontology, but the essential structures that govern those things are not just made up mental stuff.
So for Reinach, the goal of phenomenology is to like uncover and describe these mind-independent essential structures that we experience.
It
Right?
did. And
Mm.
while everything has an essence, Reinach was mainly interested in the essences that are really clear and philosophically important. He thought this opened up this huge area for philosophical inquiry, like a practically incalculably large realm of the a priori. Those are his words. He even imagined specific eidetic disciplines, like an eidetic psychology that would explore the essential structures of mental states, or an eidetic social ontology focused on the essential features of social things.
Now, the word essence, it can sound kind of abstract, even mystical. The Stanford Encyclopedia entry even mentions that Reinach knew this was a potential problem. So how did he make this concept like grounded and clear for a philosopher?
He was very aware of that potential confusion, and he made it very clear that talking about essences isn't about appealing to some hidden or supernatural realm. For Reinach, essences are a specific kind of object, ideal objects, and like any object, they can be apprehended or understood by a subject. But importantly, he disagreed with Husserl's later ideas by saying that we don't need some special, super secret method to grasp these essences.
Interesting. So how do we grasp these essential structures according to Reinach? What's the method?
He thought that sometimes even just one well-chosen example can be enough to reveal the underlying essence. Like, when someone makes a promise and understands what it means, they can see that all promises, by their very nature, are directed at a specific person. He even said that sometimes just using our imagination can be enough to grasp an essence. He used this example of understanding the color orange, like how it relates to red and yellow, just by imagining them without needing to actually see an orange.
Wow, that's a big claim about the power of intuition and imagination in philosophy. But the Stanford Encyclopedia entry also says we shouldn't take this too simply.
Right. Reinach wasn't saying that phenomenology is just about having a quick intuition and calling it a day. He thought that after that initial intuitive grasp, you need to do a lot of work to verify it, to really understand its internal structure, to see how it relates to other essences, and to carefully examine the conditions under which it can show up in concrete examples.
And what about how these essences connect to the actual things in the world that have them? He talks about Platonism, right? Where does he stand on that?
He definitely engages with the Platonic tradition, and scholars are still debating whether he was a full-on Platonist. But even if there are some similarities to Plato, it's definitely not a naive or simple kind of Platonism. He straight up rejected the idea that essences have the same properties as the things that have them. Like, just because the essence of a triangle includes having three sides, it doesn't mean that the essence of triangularity itself is somehow triangular. Instead, this essential property just means that anything that is a triangle must have three sides. It's a necessary state of affairs.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's move on to his general ontology. Reinach had a specific way of understanding the most basic categories of being, right?
Yeah, he built upon and kind of refined ideas that were popular back then, especially among thinkers like Husserl and Meinong. He agreed with them on this fundamental distinction between objects and states of affairs, and he thought those are the two most general categories that, like, structure how we understand reality.
Okay, so let's break that down. What exactly is an object in Reinach's ontology?
For him, objects can be either real or ideal. Real objects are the kind of things that exist in time and are individuals, like a mountain, which is a physical object that takes up space and exists over time, or a thought or feeling, which is a mental object that only exists in time. Ideal objects, on the other hand, are not affected by time, they're temporal. And within ideal objects, he made another distinction between sortal essences, which basically give us the rules for counting and identifying things of a certain kind, like the essence of human being, and non-sortal essences, which are qualities, like the essence of redness. He also had this concept of moments, which are like individualized properties or tropes, specific instances of qualities like the specific redness of this rose.
I'm following. And how do those objects relate to what he called underlying situations or unitary complexes?
So, a unitary complex is just an individual object combined with its moments. For example, the red rose is a complex made up of the individual rose and its particular redness. And Reinach said these unitary complexes are what found states of affairs. In our example, the complex of the red rose is what makes it possible for the rose to be red. That's a state of affairs.
That leads us right to states of affairs,
Mm.
or Sachverhalt in German. He thought they were totally different from objects and complexes, right? What makes them different?
Totally. First off, states of affairs either obtain or don't obtain, while objects either exist or don't exist. Reinach's buddy, Theodor Conrad, explained this by saying that a state of affairs obtains if and only if its corresponding complex exists. So, the rose is red is a state of affairs that obtains only if the red rose, the complex, actually exists. Second, states of affairs have this structure where they say something about something else, and they can be either positive, like the being f of x, or negative, like the not being f of x. That's super important. Only states of affairs can be negative because they're the only things that have this structure of saying something about something else. There's no such thing as a negative object, essence, quality, or complex.
And that structure, where they say something about something else, that has
Mhm.
more implications for how states of affairs work.
Right.
He said they need an object to, like, complete them.
Exactly. Depending on what kind of statement is being made, a state of affairs can be monadic, involving just one object, like Socrates is wise, or polyadic, involving multiple objects and a relationship between them, like Paris loves Helen. And then, this is where it gets a little controversial, he also said there are impersonal states of affairs, like it rains, which he thought refers to a state of affairs that doesn't say something about a specific object.
Interesting. And he thought these distinctions, these basic categories of being, had implications for logic too, right? How did that work?
Yeah. He argued that the principle of non-contradiction, which says that a positive state of affairs and its opposite, the negative one, can't both be true at the same time, is actually grounded in the nature of states of affairs themselves. And he distinguished this from the principle of bivalence, which is about the truth values of propositions. For Reinach, states of affairs are what make propositions true or false. They're the truth makers, while propositions are the truth bearers. He even went as far as saying that a lot of principles that we usually think of as purely logical, like the theory of deduction with its relation of ground and consequent, are actually ontological because they reflect how states of affairs work, not just how events relate to each other causally.
And states of affairs can also have modal properties, right? Like they can be possible or necessary.
Exactly. They can have alethic modalities like possibility and necessity. Reinach often connected necessity to those essential structures we talked about earlier, and they can also have deontic properties, like being permissible or obligatory.
What about time? Do states of affairs exist in time?
He said they can be either a temporal, like mathematical truths, 3 is greater than 2, or temporal, like the tree is blossoming. But he made this subtle point. Even temporal states of affairs exist in time, but they don't unfold over time like events do. A state of affairs just is or isn't. It doesn't have a duration like a process does.
And lastly, how do we become aware of these states of affairs, according to Reinach's epistemology?
He argued that we come to know states of affairs through specific acts of cognition, often expressed in language using that clauses or qualifiers. And he thought we can even perceive negative states of affairs, like when we expect something to be the case and then realize it's not. He distinguished this act of cognizing, or erkennen in German, from belief, saying that cognizing is not about believing or disbelieving, and it happens in specific moments, while beliefs are either positive or negative and tend to last over time. But these acts of cognizing are super important for motivating and justifying our beliefs about the world. Some scholars even think this idea kind of foreshadows the knowledge-first approach in contemporary epistemology.
That's a really thorough explanation of his general ontology. Now, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry also highlights his contributions to social ontology, which is something he's known for. What were his main ideas about how social entities exist?
He's considered a pioneer in uncovering the ontological status of social and institutional things. Let's think about a promissory obligation again, that duty that comes up when someone makes a promise. This obligation can be fulfilled, which means it exists in some way, but it doesn't really fit into the traditional categories of being. It's not a real object like a physical thing because it doesn't have a location in space. And it's not a mental object either because it's not the same as the promisor's belief or feeling of commitment, and it can exist even if those mental states change. And it's not a purely ideal object like a mathematical truth because it comes into being and can cease to exist. It's temporal.
Right, right. So it's not real, mental, or strictly ideal. Where does it fit in his framework?
He saw some similarities between these social things and states of affairs. Like they can have this ground consequent relationship, the promise being the ground for the obligation. They seem to be about relationships and they exist in time. But he didn't explicitly say they are states of affairs. So it's still an open question, like what's the fundamental nature of these social things that shape so much of our lives? It's, something to think about.
This connects to his theory of social acts, right?
Yeah.
He developed that partly as a response to Husserl's view of language.
Yeah, exactly. Husserl, following Brentano, was all about the intentionality of consciousness, how our mental states are directed at things. He argued that all language use ultimately refers back to inner experiences, but Reinach disagreed, especially when it came to things like making a promise, which isn't just describing an inner experience. So he developed this groundbreaking theory of social acts, which, it's crazy, was like decades ahead of similar work by Austin and Searle.
So what was the gist of Reinach's theory? What were the main parts?
He made this fundamental distinction between what he called spontaneous acts, where someone intentionally makes something happen in their own mind, like intending, willing, or importantly, promising, and then there are passive experiences, which are just things that happen to us. And then he said different kinds of spontaneous acts have different goals and therefore different conditions for being successful. Like the point of a promise is to create an obligation and a claim, while the point of reporting an intention is just to communicate a mental state that you already have.
And that's where his concept of need of being heard, or Vernehmungsbedürftigkeit, comes in, right? What's so important about that idea?
Right. He said that certain spontaneous acts, especially social ones, need to be registered or heard by the person they're directed at for them to really work. Like for a promise to actually create an obligation and a claim, the person being promised something has to actually receive and understand the promise. This need of being heard is what makes social acts like promising, commanding, questioning, apologizing, informing, all those things different. They usually involve speaking or some kind of action that follows rules and is directed at another person. But purely internal acts like forming an intention or even non-social acts like cursing, they don't need to be communicated to someone else to achieve their goal.
But promises and intentions are still connected, right? How did Reinach see that relationship?
They're very closely connected. He said that a real promise requires that the person making the promise actually intends to do the thing they promised. If that intention isn't there, then it's just a pseudo-performance, like he called it. It doesn't have the internal part needed to make the social consequences of a real promise happen. And he said the same goes for other social acts, like questioning usually requires being uncertain about something, and informing requires actually believing what you're saying is true, and so on.
In his book, The A Priori Foundations of the Civil Law, he goes really deep into specific social acts, focusing on promising. What were some of his main insights about promising?
One of his biggest points was that promises have this inherent power to create obligations. They're not just social practices that happen to lead to obligations, they're obligation generators that we discover, not invent. He even compared it to a basic math truth like 1 plus 1 equals 2, saying that the connection between a promise and its obligation is just as fundamental and can't be reduced to anything else. He rejected any attempts to explain the binding force of promises through things like social practices, institutions, expectations, trust, or joint decisions. For him, the act of promising itself creates a claim and an obligation.
That's a pretty strong stance on how powerful promising is. It sounds kind of controversial.
It is a strong stance, and yeah, it's been debated a lot. And Reinach went even further, saying that promises create real obligations even if the content of the promise is immoral. He thought even an immoral promise is still a promise and creates a reason, a pro tanto reason, to keep it. It's like a preliminary or conditional reason.
But we wouldn't say it's morally right to keep an immoral promise, would we? How does he deal with that?
That's where his distinction between social normativity and axiological normativity comes in. Promises create social obligations, while axiological normativity, which includes moral, aesthetic, and epistemic normativity, is based on values. He argued that if something is morally right, it means there's a duty to make it happen. And for him, values are ideal objects that we grasp through a special kind of feeling, which he said is different from just having an emotional response. He also thought that values are organized hierarchically, so higher values create stronger duties. So with an immoral promise, the duty to not do the immoral thing, which is probably based on a higher value, might be stronger than the social obligation to keep the promise.
That's a really nuanced way to understand how social and moral obligations can conflict. So to wrap up, what do you think is Adolf Reinach's legacy for us as philosophers today?
His influence on early phenomenology was huge, like we talked about. People like Dietrich von Hildebrand took his ideas and ran with them, especially in developing the ontology of value and phenomenological accounts of action, emotion, and knowledge. And Reinach's emphasis on studying essences was a big deal for a lot of early phenomenologists. His theory of states of affairs, while it's been debated and tweaked, was a major contribution to ontology. And his work on social and legal ontology is still inspiring philosophers today who are working in those areas. But beyond specific theories, he really pushed for a collaborative, problem-focused way of doing philosophy, and he articulated this vision of phenomenology as a rigorous science with its own methods.
It definitely sounds like his work is still super relevant for today's philosophical problems.
Absolutely. He had so many insights about the philosophy of mind, action, values, law, social ontology, and all these areas are still ripe for exploration and could be brought into current debates. His work offers this unique and often overlooked perspective on really fundamental questions about reality, knowledge, and social interaction.
This deep dive into Reinach's thought has been so insightful. So for our listeners who are into philosophy, what are the main takeaways? What should we be thinking about? For me, it's this powerful idea of mind-independent a priori structures that shape both our experience and reality itself. And I also find his account of normativity really compelling, how it's not just about social conventions, but about the nature of acts, like promising and this objective hierarchy of values. What about you? What stands out to you the most?
I'm really struck by the potential of his realist phenomenology to reveal these essential connections and structures in all sorts of areas, from the logical foundations of thinking to how social interaction works. And his work on social ontology especially gives us this framework for understanding the unique way that social institutions and obligations exist, and it's still so insightful and relevant today.
Here's something to think about as you continue your philosophical journey. If we take Reinach's realist phenomenology seriously, how should we rethink the relationship between our concepts and the fundamental structures of reality?
Hmm.
Are we missing any a priori connections and essential structures because we're looking at things through the lens of more traditional philosophical approaches?
That's a really great question. And building on his analysis of promising and other social acts, we could ask, what are the essential parts of other basic social institutions and obligations that we often take for granted? Could Reinach's method help us understand things like contracts, laws, or even social groups themselves?
So much to think about. If this exploration of Reinach's philosophy has got you curious, I highly recommend checking out his original writings and learning more about early phenomenology. There's so much to discover there. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.